So in the interest of time, I'll introduce myself, right?
Yeah.
So as I said before, my name is Michael Lombardo. Tonight I wanted to talk about avian migration navigation because we're kind of at the tail end of the fall migration. And there's really some really spectacular things that birds are capable of doing during their navigation from here to their overwintering grounds and back again. That's why we call it there and back again. And so one way that I thought to start talking about this is the elementary school that I went to called Covert Elementary School. It's a picture from the 1950s. I started there in 1959. But I remember very, very distinctly when I was in 5th grade maybe, that I went to the little tiny library that the elementary school had at the time. And I found this book, which many of you have read. Many of us, I really very closely and read it really fast from front to back. Remember that the subtitle of the book is right, The Hobbit, we're there and back again, right? That's really about Bilbo Baggins going there, getting the ring, and coming back again, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is there and back again. But when we do that, we have to talk about the difference between migration and navigation. So migration is when movement between a breeding area and a non-breeding area, and it's triggered by environmental factors, and sometimes it's triggered by internal rhythms, and it's usually associated with, as we all know, right, by a forecast of a resource shortage, right? Like seasonal changes in resource availability, like the availability of food, for example, or escaping inhospitable conditions. So it's really pretty predictable. And most everybody, even people that aren't very much interested in nature, notice when the birds are gone, and then when the birds come back again in the spring and they start singing, they start noticing all that activity. That's not the same as navigation. Navigation is using cues from the environment, for example, to orient your motion from one location to another. Right? So navigating from point A to point B. Right? That's not the same as migration. So we're going to talk about both migration and we'll talk about navigation. What kind of cues do birds use to get from one place to another place? And we study the movements of birds in different ways. Some of the ways are really kind of old-fashioned, and as technology has improved, we've improved our ability to follow birds. But one of the most basic ways of studying migration is using mist nets, and you can see somebody over here with a mist net. And so mist net's made of a very fine material that when it's up against a background like shrubbery, for example, it just about disappears. And as the birds are flying from one place to another, they don't see the net, they get entangled in the net, and then you can remove them from the net, which is always a tricky proposition, and then ban the birds. And you give the birds an aluminum band, in the United States, an aluminum band that comes from the US Geological Survey, that has a unique number on it. And if that bird is ever caught again by anybody, or the bird is found dead and it has a band on it, there's information on the band for sending the data, sending the band number, to the Migratory Bird Lab. And if you do that, you get a card back, usually pretty fast from them, that tells you where that bird was originally banded and when. Now, this is a way that we've studied migration for a very long time, but it's really, it's very labor intensive, and it's a kind of biased view of migration and the movement of birds. It's very labor intensive because you put out nets at places like the Kalamazoo Nature Center, for example, or at Whitefish Point, or at U of M in Dearborn, for example, where there are banding stations or have been banding stations. And The nets have to be monitored very closely, so the birds aren't in the nets for too long, so that if the weather is rainy, they don't get wet. You have to check the nets frequently because sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks are pretty smart. And so if they find the area, they'll pick birds out of the net. My wife Leslie showed me one time a video of white-tailed deer picking birds out of the net. So you have to really keep really close on them. And you can be banning thousands and thousands of birds, but the probability of recovering those birds is really pretty small. But so many birds have been banded over time that recoveries of banded birds give us kind of an idea of what birds are in what area at what time of year. So there are important banding stations locally, like I said, U of M, Dearborn, Whitefish Point, Kalamazoo Nature Center. There are also very important banding stations in places like Cape May, New Jersey, which we'll mention a little later, and then down on the Gulf of Mexico, where birds fly across the Gulf of Mexico to Central America and South America, and then come back across the Gulf of Mexico, when they're coming back to North America to breed. We can also follow birds by radio tracking them, and here's a Clark's nutcracker with a radio pack on its back, and then you can take that antenna into the field and see if you can relocate that bird. And what really limits the ability to radio track the birds, which is also very labor intensive, is the size of the batteries for the radio transmitter, right? Because you have to have a radio transmitter and a battery that have a negligible impact on the weight of the bird. Because if you keep adding weight to the bird, it really hinders its ability to fly. More recently, researchers have been using what are called geolocators, like we see on this painted bunting here. And what that is a little tag that keeps track of time, and it keeps track of light and dark cycles. And so you put the pack on the bird, like that painted bunting, and then when you recover that bird, you can take that tag off, plug it into a computer, and it'll tell you the light and dark cycle every day while that bird was not in your hands. And so from that light and dark circle, we can tell where that bird was in terms of latitude and longitude, because daylight changes in a very, very predictable way. Now, this is also very labor intensive because, as we'll mention in a little bit, so if I put a geolocator on this adult painted bunting, it only has a 50% chance of living to the next year. And then there's not a 100% probability of catching that same bird again. So as you'll see from the study later on, you put as many geolocators as you can afford on birds and just hope you catch many of them so you know where they went and when they went there. So the first question really we've got to think about when we think about migration is, from the clash in the 1980s, should I stay or should I go? Right? Should you stay here in Michigan, for example? Should I go to Florida or Central America or South America? Right? So one way we can get at this is kind of like an economic type of analysis, right? Cost-benefit analysis. So we got to compare like the survivorship of winter residents, birds that stay here in the winter time, like chickadees, titmice, and so on, versus migrants, birds that leave. So we can compare them, compare their lifetime reproductive success, for example. And in doing so, we have to think about what the costs of migration are. And we know it's expensive, right, to travel those long distances. It's expensive for us to travel those long distances, right? So just think of a Michigander who's a snowbird that's going down to Florida or Texas every year, driving down and then driving back. It's expensive because fuel's expensive. It's expensive for the birds because they have to get fuel, so they have to feed. So it's energy intensive. And there are also risks, and we encounter some of those risks as we go from Michigan to Florida as well. There are storms, right, which delay our movements, right? There's predation. We don't have to worry very much about predation. The birds have to worry about predation, right? So there's energy costs, and there are risks that are involved. But there are some apparent benefits of migrating, right? And those include things like escaping inhospitable conditions, like cold weather, ice, snow. One other benefit of migration is one that we live in a temperate zone that we don't often consider very much, is that in the springtime, there's an explosion of primary productivity. So there are a lot of resources that are available in the springtime at higher latitudes. So plants, insects, and so on. And then there's also this idea that people have had for a very long time that you can save energy by going to a warmer climate. So there was actually a recent paper in 2024 about Eurasian blackbirds, right? So it's a Eurasian blackbird, but it's actually in the thrush family, right? But it's called the blackbird, right? Because it's all black. It's a partial migrant. The ones they studied were partial migrants from southern Germany. We'll talk about what partial migrant means later on. But these are in birds that some of them migrate and some don't. And if you look at the map over there on the bottom right, that orange color is where the birds are during breeding. But where the purple is where you find birds all the time, find Eurasian blackbirds all the time. And what they did is they fitted the birds, those that migrated and those that were residents, with data loggers. So they had 120 birds, and those data loggers, right, measured heart rate, they measured body temperature, and they followed the birds from fall to the following spring. So with the miniaturization, right, now that we can do with computers and so on, and this sort of technology really allows us to get a lot more information than we were able to get in the past. But what they found was that 3 weeks before migration, the birds lower their metabolism, so the heart rate goes down, and so on. And while they were in warmer climates, right? So when they went down to Spain, for example, they didn't reduce their daily energy expenditure. So that suggests there might be some other benefits of migration. It's not just reducing the amount of energy you spend. So there must be some other benefits, and that we're going to talk about some of those other benefits. So life is full of trade-offs, right? So if you're going to migrate, you have to make trade-offs because there's mortality during migration, right? So you have to make the trade-off. Should I stay in these inhospitable conditions or should I take a chance on mortality by migrating? So you have to think about what your overwinter survival might be if you're in a place like Michigan, upper Michigan, right, with inhospitable conditions. And so you also have to think about what your RS means reproductive success. You have to think about what your reproductive success might be as a function of time of arrival on the breeding grounds. So what that means is, when should I come back to the breeding grounds? Earlier is usually better. But if you come back too early, think about what the weather is like in Michigan at the end of March and April. Sometimes it's really pretty inhospitable. So usually it's better to get back earlier, but sometimes it's really risky to get back earlier. And there's also, you got to think about what some of the costs of migration are while you're traveling. So this year is a little unusual, but most years it's a lot safer to drive to Florida in October than it is to fly from to Florida in October than it is to drive, right? Or drive to Florida in October than it is to drive back from Florida to Michigan in March, because you're more likely to encounter inclement weather, snow, ice, and so on. In fact, there was a very bad ice event several years ago, maybe up to a decade ago, that undoubtedly killed millions and millions of birds during migration. That was occurring during March. So these trade-offs involve survivorship, right? And so the patterns of adult survival that we see in birds varies quite a bit. Right? So most birds, great majority of birds, that hatch in any year end up dying. So if we think about songbirds in Michigan, for all the songbirds that are born in Michigan, 95% of them probably don't make it to the next breeding season because they die for a variety of reasons. They die during migration, they die because they're inexperienced in getting food, or they die because they fall victims of predation. But once they make it to their first breeding season, if they're a temperate zone migrant, like you see on the bottom list there, they have about a 35 to 50% chance of living to the next year. If they're a resident here, like a black-capped chickadee or a tufted titmouse, for example, or a nuthatch, downy woodpecker, they have about 20 to 50% chance of living from year 1 to year 2. Tropical birds, resident birds, they have very high mortality for youngsters, but tropical residents have an annual survival rate of about 80 to 90%. So you can see for temperate zone birds, right, life is pretty dicey, right, with only usually about a 50% chance of making it to the next year. So we want to know why you migrate. So if you look at this map here, North and Central and South America, you can see on the left is where in orange is a breeding range, and then the blue is a non-breeding range. So the question has always been whether it was what we're seeing with our migratory birds is whether we're seeing breeding birds that have shifted their non-breeding range south, so they're migrating south, or maybe what we're really looking at is tropical birds. Because think about things like orioles, like Baltimore orioles. They're only here for a few months. They spend most of their time traveling in the tropics. So maybe they're just tropical birds that are just visiting us to exploit the explosion of primary productivity in the springtime, right? So that's the bottom panel, right? So it's a shift of the breeding range to the temperate region. Well, a guy named Ben Winger and his students have looked at this, and it looks like the data are pointing in the direction that really what's going on is what we're seeing is a shift in the non-breeding range to the south as birds are escaping inhospitable conditions and going to places where there's a lot of competition because of the resident birds in the tropics, but going to places where there is kind of like a steady state of resources. So this is relatively new because when I was a graduate student and we started teaching about and talking about migration, the prevailing view was the one on the bottom, is that when we see orioles and indigo buntings, really what we're looking at are tropical birds. But really, no, it's really that these are northern birds that have shifted their non-breeding range south. And as we mentioned before, predation is a real risk during migration. So this is a bird called Eleanor's falcon, and Eleanor's falcon lives in the Mediterranean. Now, most birds breed in the spring, but if we think about Europe, most of the birds that breed, migratory birds that breed in Europe, are moving through either Spain to get to West Africa, or they're moving through Turkey in the Middle East to get to East Africa. Eleanor's falcon takes advantage of this because their breeding season is in the fall, when there's literally billions of birds that are passing from Europe into West Africa. Because there's just this tremendous surplus of food. So instead of breeding in the spring like most birds, they're breeding in the fall when there's plenty of food for them and for their offspring. And we do see some really important adaptations for migration. So some birds, like this little ruby-throated hummingbird, doubles its weight before migrating across the Gulf of Mexico. And mostly what they're putting on is fat, because fat can be used for energy, and fat is less dense than muscle. And so just think about it, right? Hummingbirds live on nectar. They'll eat tiny insects like gnats and so on, but they'll live on nectar. And so think about it in our context, right? So you're taking off from, say the Gulf of Mexico somewhere, Mississippi, Alabama, flying across the Gulf of Mexico. There are no flowers. There's no place to stop, right? No place to stop and take a rest. So you got to be really fueled up before you go. And so that's what they do. They fuel up. They put on fat, because they can use that fat for energy. As you all know, their metabolic rates are really high, right? They burn the equivalent of 150,000 kilocalories per day, human equivalent of that. when they're hovering, right? 1,000 to 3,000 wing beats per minute and over 1,000 heartbeats per minute, right? So their engines are really hot, right? And they're going really fast. So they have to be ready to fly. Now you can see for them, right, if they're flying across the Gulf of Mexico, right, flying across the Gulf of Mexico, and they run into inclement weather and storms, like a hurricane, and get blown off course, it's curtains, right? Because there's no place, they can't stop. There's no place to stop, there's no nectar. So those kinds of storms, as they pop up, can have a really big impact on these migratory populations. So migration is really risky. Another interesting adaptation is one we've seen, that was one study that looked at Swainson's thrushes, right, which breed in more northern latitudes, some of them in the upper peninsula and some of them in the upper part of the lower peninsula, that orange there. And we find them in the areas that are yellow during migration. But birds reduce their sleep time while traveling. So these Swainson's thrushes with loggers on them, it looked like they were taking 9-second naps, power naps. So just take a 9-second nap and keep going. And they consume their own muscles for energy, right? Break down their muscles, and we do too. When we exercise and use up all our carbohydrate stores, then we start breaking down our muscles. But it gets even better. So this is a bar-tailed godwit that migrates from Russia to West Africa. And they stop midway to refuel. And their body fat increases by 10 to 30% while they're refueling. And early in refueling, when they're stopping partway, they gain muscle mass and they put on fat. But right around the time when they're ready to depart from that stopover area to West Africa, they lose mass as their digestive system atrophies. So they reduce the amount of weight that they're carrying around due to their digestive system, because they're not going to be feeding. So it's a strategic management of mass. So they're reducing a part of their weight that they're not going to be using. Some birds put on fat, right? But if you put on fat, you put it on weight. And so one of the things that makes flying expensive is weight. Right? The lighter you are, the less expensive flying is. Now, some warblers migrate long distances. Other warblers, like the yellow-rumped warbler, doesn't migrate very far. Sometimes it doesn't migrate at all. So with the yellow-rumped warbler here, you can see in the orange where you find them during breeding. Yellow is migration, and the blue is overwintering. The purple is where you find them year-round. Black pole warblers, right, on the right, you can see that if they're migrating from the eastern United States or down through the eastern United States, they're going 1,800 miles through 1,800 miles over water, right, to South America. And in fact, one of my professors in graduate school, when he was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, was studying a bit about migration, about black pole warblers and where they were captured. And this will be relevant for what we talk about later. It looked like, at least for part of their way in New England, they were following I-95 as using that as a landmark. But anyway, they have to fly across vast amounts of ocean, and there's no insects for them to feed on. There's no place to stop. And you can see they put on a lot of fat. So the yellow-rumped warblers on the left, right, and the black-pole warblers on the right, and you saw that white on his abdomen is all fat. So they're putting on fat during migration that they need to fly those long distances. So if you migrate, you can use a variety of different strategies. And these are some strategies that we use, right, when we migrate. So think about people that snowbirds, right, coming from Michigan going to Florida. Some people just drive nonstop, right, 24 hours or more, right, just all the way down to wherever they're going. Or you can take short hops and refuel. Drive 8 hours a day for 3 days. You lost the microphone.
Sorry, we lost the microphone. Sure, what happened?
So you can go nonstop like many people do, or you can take a lot of short hops, right? Drive 10 hours today, 12 hours tomorrow, right? Or break it up even more. Or you can go across a broad front, right? As some species of birds go across broad front, or funnel through migration bottlenecks, like Whitefish Point, for example, up on the Upper Peninsula. So if you think of people leaving the Upper Midwest as they're going to Florida, right? Initially, it's a kind of a broad front, right? But if they're coming from Michigan or Ohio, then where are they going? They're trying to funnel through I-75 on their way down. So it's following the same kind of pattern. And so sometimes males and females migrate separately. Sometimes they migrate together. Sometimes males and females overwinter together. Sometimes they overwinter separately. We'll talk about some examples. And different breeding populations from different geographic locations often use different overwintering locations. Right? They don't all go to the same place. So we see some of these patterns. This is a Hudsonian godwit, and you can see it breeds up there on the southern coast of Alaska, up number 1. And then it goes to the east coast of North America, flies down along the coast to South America. There's a stopover in northern South America. Then makes its way down towards Patagonia and then Chile, right, where it overwinters. And then it makes a long trip back up the coast along the Pacific Ocean, through Central America, up the middle of the continent, a couple of staging areas in the Upper Plains states, up in Canada, and then back to their breeding grounds. Right? They do kind of a loop. So it's taking them months to do this, right? Many birds take months. Another one is this common cuckoo that's from Europe. And it follows the path. It's a loop migration. It follows the path of those numbers, right? So they're breeding up in Scandinavia, and then they go to northern Germany, Poland, then down towards Hungary, right? Down to Central Africa, down to West Africa, down to, move over in West Africa to the southern coast of West Africa, back up to Italy, and then back up to Scandinavia. So they kind of do a loop in their migratory route, their yearly route. Willow warblers, which have been studied really quite extensively by Scandinavian ornithologists, have an interesting pattern. If they breed below 60 degrees north, they go southwest to West Africa. But if they breed above 63 degrees north, then they go towards East Africa. Now, that's interesting for an evolutionary biologist like myself, because that means that those populations can be diverging from one another because they don't overwinter in the same places, they're not breeding in the same places, so they can accumulate genetic differences between those populations. Some birds show what's known as altitudinal migration, like this resplendent quetzal in Costa Rica, where it goes to the Pacific coast for breeding from February to June, and then goes for non-breeding towards the Atlantic coast from November to January. In the western United States, mountain bluebirds will do the same thing. So they'll be at high elevations in the wintertime, and then come down to lower elevation. They'll be breed at high elevations, and then in the wintertime come down to lower elevations. So they're avoiding those, at least the mountain bluebirds, are avoiding the inhospitable conditions and no food at those high elevations in the winter. Some birds, as some of you know, show eruptive migration, like this redpoll. Right? And so if you look at the graph, all the peaks, the high peaks, are years in which there are a lot of redpolls. Some years there aren't very many here. Other years there are lots. And it depends on the availability of food in the wintertime at their northern latitudes. And so if you go to finchnetwork.org, you can see the yearly forecasts for the migration of things like redpolls and evening grosbeaks and pine grosbeaks and some others as well. So it all depends on the availability of food up north. And some birds like this European blackbird or Eurasian blackbird and our American robin are really partial migrants. So if we look at this map, right, of Europe and Eurasia, the red is breeding, green is resident, means they're there all year, and the purple is non-breeding, But if you go to any place, it's like in France, what you'll find are some birds that are resident birds, and some birds that came from the areas that are red, right? That are there in the wintertime. And if you notice, also some of them from Scandinavia go up to Iceland to breed. And as weather has been changing and becoming more temperate in many places, there's an increase in some migratory birds that are found in places like the United Kingdom in the wintertime than used to be, because they're coming from Scandinavia and from Europe and going to England and Ireland, which is bathed by the Gulf Coast, by the Gulf Stream, right, with the warm water and warm air from the Gulf Stream, and they're spending winter there. So many of you seen dark-eyed juncos, right? It's our first sign of winter, right? Females tend to winter farther south than do the males. And really what the males are doing is they're not going so far away, so when spring starts approaching, they can get a jump start getting to their breeding grounds. So they don't migrate as far south. And they return from migration earlier than do females. And that's a pattern that we see in most birds, most songbirds, is the males get back from migration before the females do, because they get there to establish their territories. Now you think they could say, okay, well, if I'm going to come back to Michigan, like red-winged blackbirds at the end of February and March, forget it. The weather's crappy, I'm not coming back. You know, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay down south. But that's a big mistake, because if you stay down south for longer and you come back, right? You come back, all those good territories are taken by males that have taken the risk to come back and establish those territories. So they're in a bind, they're in a cruel bind. They've got to come back as early as they can, but not too early, but as early as they can to establish territories. And that's the typical pattern that we see in most birds. So the species I study, tree swallows, the males would come back and start establishing their territories around their nest sites. And then a week or 2 weeks or sometimes even longer, then the females would show up. Right? And again, like I said, the males could say, forget it, I'm not coming back because the weather's horrible. But if you do that, all the good spots are going to be taken up. So you got to take the risk. You got to take your chances coming back. So how do birds know when to migrate? Right? So the biblical prophet Jeremiah says, the stork in the sky knows the time to migrate. But how do they know? What cue are they using? Right? And as we all know, if we've been watching birds for a while, the timing and arrival and departures of migrants is really consistent from year to year. Right? So if you look, this is, it's from the New Yorker magazine. It's supposed to be like the big board at Grand Central Terminal, right, with the trains. So if you look on top, it's, the yellow-billed cuckoo arrives in early May, departs in late September. Ruby-throated hummingbird arrives in mid-May, leaves in mid-September. It's really consistent from year to year. So how are they doing it, right? What cues are they using? Well, they can use a variety of different cues, right? They can use changes in day length, they can use changes in weather, right? Changes in vegetation or food availability. They can follow other birds, they can use social cues, right? Everybody else is leaving, I should go too, right? Or they can have an internal clock, what the Germans call a Zeitgeist, which we'll talk about. Now, if you look at those cues, the ones that are the most regular are changes in day length, because that's consistent every year, right? Changes in weather, right? We all live in Michigan, right? So we've all experienced warm weather in the fall and really cold, inhospitable weather in the spring, into May sometimes. Right? So you can't go by weather. That affects vegetation and food availability. So you can't use that because you can get fooled by that. Social cues, that's kind of risky as well, right? Because maybe they're making a mistake, right? You don't want to make a mistake because you'll potentially perish during migration. So change in day length is really regular. And if you have an internal clock, right? Something genetic that tells you when day length is something, it's time to get ready to go. And we'll talk about how that occurs. kind of how that occurs. So there are some very famous locations to see birds during migration. So in the upper left is Cape May, New Jersey, where birds are hopping across the Delaware Bay when they're moving north and south. The upper right is Whitefish Point, right, where birds are hopping across Lake Superior. Down the bottom left is Hawk Mountain in eastern Pennsylvania, where the hawks follow the Kittatinny Ridge because they get useful updrafts that reduce their costs of migration. And then Point Pelee in the lower right in Ontario, right? So the most southernmost part of Ontario. So it makes the voyage across Lake Erie as short as possible, right? And so birds congregate in those places waiting for optimal conditions to fly across long expanses of water because they don't like to do it because there's no place to stop. Although if you're on a boat or a ship, some of you may have had the experience of small birds, warblers for example, hitch and ride for a while, they get tired. So a good friend of ours was in the Coast Guard stationed in Duluth, and he said small birds would sometimes land on their Coast Guard ships while they were on Lake Superior. And some birds really have spectacular migrations, right? Really spectacular, like this Arctic tern, right? That migrates from the Arctic to the Antarctic yearly. So these birds were marked and measured. So you can see the one in blue went 34,600 kilometers south, right? So multiply that by 0.6 is 18,000 miles, right? And then 26,000 miles back north, 26,000 kilometers back north, right? So it's incredible, every year, just down and back, down and back. One of the more spectacular ones is a bar-tailed godwit that we see in the upper right. So they breed in Alaska, and they feed in New Zealand overwintering. And they have, on their way down, it's nonstop over the ocean. And so that distance is at or more than the limit that airplanes can fly without refueling. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see them coming across the Atlantic. Two birds flew as far south, far as New Zealand, without stopping. Right? That's really pretty spectacular. And some birds show really what we can think of as great winter sight fidelity. These are white-crowned sparrows. So and this is a really classic experiment, and I'll tell you about another one in a minute, in which they capture some birds during the breeding season in California, overwintering season, I should say, in California. And they put them on an airplane, flew some to Maryland, flew some to Louisiana, let them go. Then the next year they showed up at the same breeding spots in California. So what they did, same winter spots in California. So what they did is they went to Louisiana, flew to Maryland, and those black lines, they probably flew back to their breeding grounds in Alaska and Western Canada to breed, and then back down to their overwintering grounds in Florida. So you're in Maryland, you've never been there before. How do you get back to Juneau, Alaska? Or you've been, you're in Baton Rouge. How do you get back to Alaska? What kind of cues do you use? And they can do this pretty fast. I mean, one of the classic experiments I've heard about, but I've never seen it actually in the literature, but I've heard about it, is that researchers at the Michigan Biological Station caught some purple martins, and they flew them to Wisconsin, right? And the birds got back to Douglas Lake before the researchers did. They just fly back.
I love it.
What do they use to navigate? That's what we're going to get to. And last April, we learned about Kirtland's warblers, right? They winter in the Bahamas. And they breed in the upper part of the lower peninsula of Michigan. So they go over land, they go over water, and they have to have, this is something that we talked about a lot last year, they have to have both habitats, right? They have to have breeding habitats in the upper part of the lower peninsula, and they also need overwintering habitats in the Bahamas. And so the US workers and Bahamian workers are working to preserve bird habitat in both places. So how do we know where birds overwinter? Right? So we can make observations during migration and during winter, so visual observations. We can recover bird bands, right? Again, that's labor intensive. These days we can use radar, we can use next rad radar, I'll show you examples of that. We can use radio telemetry. Again, that's labor intensive. And geolocators. So we can use radar and NextRad. So if you go, I tried to do this before, but it didn't hook up for us. If you go to Birdcast and just type that into your Google search, it'll take you to a page that shows you live migration maps and allows you to predict where migration is going to be highest on any night. So this was the 7th of May in 2023. And you can see where birds were moving up north through the center part of the United States. But if you look at the key on the right, it really wasn't a whole lot of birds. We can also use NextRad to look at roosts of large numbers of birds. And this was one of my colleagues sent me this one. So this is the east coast of Florida, west of Merritt Island near I-95. And you can't really see what happens here, but too bad I can't show you the video. What happens is you can see tree swallows, large numbers of tree swallows, coming out of a roost. Right? Just large numbers of tree swallows coming out of a roost and dispersing up and down the coast during the day, and then coming back to that roost at nighttime in the winter. So these colleagues use geolocators. And so you can see the open squares, Saskatchewan, Wisconsin, right across the lake from us, and Ontario. Those birds all went down to rice fields down in Louisiana in the wintertime, right? So that was their stopover. Some of them probably stayed there. But birds from British Columbia and birds from my friend Dave Shuttler's place up in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, they don't go to Louisiana. They probably head down the Atlantic coast down to Florida. The ones from British Columbia probably go down to California. They didn't go down to Louisiana. So we can use geolocators to find out where they go. We also can use, and this is more sciencey, right? They can use isotopes in feathers by comparing heavy water, deuterium, right, and normal water. And deuterium decreases as you go from southeast to northwest. Strontium isotopes vary from east to west. Hydrogen and strontium isotopes were studied in tree swallow feathers by a woman named Megan Selleck, and she actually came out to our study site in 2007. And tree swallows molt and grow their feathers at the end of their breeding season. So if you catch a bird and you look at its feather and you measure the amounts of strontium and hydrogen isotopes, you can tell where the birds were when they were growing those feathers. And so they were able to, her group was able to correctly assign 74% of individuals to their site of origin using both isotopes. And you can see our little black spot there in West Michigan. But then I think the last I saw, Megan went on to medical school. And Megan, I can't remember, Leslie, you remember what her friend's name was? They stayed with us for a couple of days and they were collecting birds. And they were actually very lucky because right after they left, our breeding population was devastated by raccoons and feral cats. So the year before, I banded something like 400 tree swallow nestlings, and that year I only banded one. Only one lived long enough to be banded because the rest got eaten by cats. So, how do birds find their way? They use some of the same things that we do. They use landmarks. They use social cues. Right? Follow all those cars going down I-75 in Florida. Right? You can use the sun, right? Sun's really predictable. Rises in the east, sets in the west. You can use the stars. There can be genetic mechanisms involved. The geomagnetic field of the Earth varies. You can use that. You can use odors. Right? You can use something called infrasound, like the movement of the Earth's surface itself, like tectonic plates. So we'll talk about each one of these. So when I was a freshman at Ohio State, the Ohio State University, right? It's a huge place. Look at all those buildings, right? And so my dormitory was down here by that red circle, right? And I had to get up by the red circle where Smith labs were for chemistry. I didn't want to look like a real, freshman walking around looking down at a map, right? So I did what a lot of people, I memorized the map, right? I memorized what's the best way for me to get there. So I got there, right? when I first got there, right, I went, follow the main road, right? I don't have to make a couple of turns. But after a couple of days, what do you learn? Shortcuts, right? You learn the shortcuts. But there's a problem with using topographic cues like shorebirds use, right? They use the coastlines. Is that sometimes the cue is obscure. You can't see it. Or it changes. So these are some of the flyways that shorebirds use, right? And so we can see the Atlantic flyway, basically follow the coast down, follow the Mississippi down, for example, follow the Pacific coast down in North America. Then we talk about some studies that were done, mainly at Cornell University, but some that were done overseas. So the folks up at Cornell said, okay, so birds use, like homing pigeons, probably use topographic cues, like the rest of us, to get from one place to another. So they did an experiment, they put translucent contact lenses on the birds. So now they can't see the topographic cues very easily.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes. All public computers will be shutting down in 15 minutes. Thank you.
So they take them away from their loft. Some of them have clear contact lenses. Others have these translucent contact lenses where they can't see detail, they just see light. And it turns out that the ones that have the translucent contact lenses take longer to get home, but they still get home, right? Even though they can't see towns, they can't see roads, they can't see hills, and so on. So they're still able to do it. So that suggests they're using multiple cues. You can follow a leader, like these Canada geese, right, that migrate in family groups, and youngsters follow older birds that know where they're going. Right? You can follow the leader. In Europe, the northern bald ibis does the same sort of thing, but they do something interesting. At least I don't think it's been shown in Canada geese. But northern bald ibis, they'll actually change positions. So somebody will be the leader for a while, and somebody else will take the lead. And it's costly to be the leader, right? Because you have to expend more energy than if you're a follower. Because when you follow behind, as the birds in front of you are flapping their wings, you see they're not right behind each other, or they're a little offset. Because as the bird is flapping its wing, it's sending a little vortex of air that the birds following it can use to get some lift, so it costs them less to fly. So really the people that have studied migration probably the most are American scientists, mostly at Cornell, and German scientists. So we mentioned the Zeitgeist, that internal clock, but there's also something called Zugenbruch, which is called migratory restlessness. So as the migratory seasons approach in the fall and in the spring, birds get restless. And we can actually use that restlessness to help us study migration. So we know they use the sun, right? And they use polarized light, they use ultraviolet light. And actually, we know that they use the sun because we can take them into the lab and we can fool them about what time it is. So on this chart, these two circles, the release point is north, right? And the loft is south. So if we clock shift them so that they're 3 hours slow, so it's really 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but they think it's 9 a.m. They look at the sun and they say, well, if it's 9 a.m., I should be going this way. But it's not 9 a.m., it's really 3 p.m., so they go in the wrong direction. Or you can tell them, or you can fool them, right, by shifting them so that it's really 9 a.m., but they think it's 3 p.m. because of their light-dark cycle. And then you see them going in a different direction. Many birds migrate at night. And so they use the stars, just like sailors use the stars, or use the stars. And still, they're trained to use the stars. Years ago, a friend of mine went to the Muskegon Air Show. When they had a Muskegon Air Show, we went into a C-130, and my friend Pat noticed that there was a little hatch in the cockpit. And so he asked the pilot what that hatch was. And he said, the hatch is there because if we lose our avionics, we can open the hatch and I can use a sextant to shoot the stars to figure out where I am. So we still use the stars to do that. So this was studied by Steve Emblin when he was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. And he developed, along with some others, this very simple technique to study the birds. So you put the birds in a funnel, right, that's lined with paper. On the bottom, you put an ink pad, right? You put a wire screen on it, top, so they can't get out. And they start showing Zuganru in the fall. They start showing Zuganru in the spring. So in the springtime, if you look at their foot patterns, it's towards the north. Right? And in the fall, it's towards the south, right? Exactly which way you would expect them to orient, right? The way that they orient. So it's easy to clock shift birds in the laboratory. One thing that you can do is you can take birds into the planetarium, like Steve did, and you can change the star pattern. Because we know indigo buntings migrate at night. So that's what he did, really clever experiment. So you think about it, right? Think about it. Not only was it a clever experiment, it was inexpensive, right? Because the old planetarium was on the top floor of the museum building, right? And you see he has these funnels that were easy to make. And he used ladders as stands. I mean, he didn't make stands. He just used ladders that were laying around as stands for these. And showed the birds different star patterns. So took nestlings, right, that hadn't seen the stars before. So they were all testing the planetarium with the star map. And if you don't show them a star map, when it's spring or fall, they don't show any orientation in any particular direction. They're all over the place. If you show them the normal star map, right, with the North Star in the right place, they show the appropriate seasonal orientation. If you show them a reverse star map where the North Star is in a different place, they show reverse Zuganru relative to the control birds. So in the spring, they're heading south, right? And in the fall, they're heading north. It also looked like they had to see the star map at a certain time for a certain period of time after they hatched. So it's kind of like birdsong, where you have to hear the species typical song before you, in a certain time period after you hatch, otherwise you won't sing it correctly. So I can't pretend to understand how a gene, right, can code for a protein that can code for that can cause a bird to head north when it sees the North Star in the spring and south when it sees it in the fall. But there appears to be a strong genetic component to this. So black-capped warblers in Europe, right, they breed in Scandinavia, some of them go to Great Britain, some of them stay in Great Britain now, but some of them go down to Spain, they go to West Africa. The ones from Germany go to Spain, go to West Africa. The ones from Hungary go to Turkey, through the Middle East, and go to East Africa. So guys in Germany did a clever experiment. They said, okay, let's see how genes are important. So let's take some of the birds that migrate to the southeast through Spain, that migrate southeast through Turkey, and then take some that migrate to the southwest through Spain, and mate them together and see what their babies do, right? And so the ones that go southeast, right, and the ones that go southwest, actually the figure is incorrect. The figure is incorrect. But the important thing is that the hybrids go halfway in between, right? And they show the migratory restless is halfway in between. So genes are having an important influence on this. Birds use the geomagnetic fields of the Earth, right? So the field lines intersect with the Earth's surface, the angle changes with latitude. Charlie Walcott at Cornell did a very simple and clever experiment. Took some homing pigeons, right, and he glued little magnets, super glue, to their heads. Those are the experimental birds. The control birds, he glued non-magnetic material to their heads that weighed the same as the magnets. Took them away from the roost, let them go. The ones with the magnets on their heads took longer to get home because their magnetic field is messed up. They still got home, but it took them longer to get home. So really simple experiment. It didn't cost a lot of money, simple experiment. So German scientists have done the same thing by looking at the migratory restlessness in those funnels, but they take a bird, they put it in a gigantic electromagnet, big as this room. It's a little more a little more expensive experiment, but showed the same thing. Then it turns out that if you look closely, the birds have iron receptors. So up in the upper left, there's some of the nerves that are probably important. This is part of a view of the beak, and those white spots are places where there are iron-based receptors, right? Iron oxide particles. And then if you look closely at those, that's the structure of them. So their beaks can feel the magnetic field. Now it gets even weirder, right? It gets even weirder in that because for some birds, like this garden warbler, this is a cross-section through their retina, and rods and cones are up on top, and the magnetic cells are down at the bottom. It looks like in some species it's located, like this warbler, it's located only in the right eye. But in other birds, it's in both eyes. So it's a complex phenomenon. Some birds use odors. Now, I don't have pictures here, but some studies have been done in Europe and the United States with homing pigeons, and seeing if they use odors to get back to their lofts, to their homes. And they're able to use deflectors to get to alter where the odors are going or where the odors are coming from. And American scientists have been pretty unsuccessful in showing that birds have been using odors. But scientists in Europe, especially in Italy, have showed that homing pigeons, they apparently use odors to get from one place to, it helps them get from one place to another. Oceanic birds, right, the featureless ocean, some birds use odors to help them navigate. So, there's some features on the bottom of the ocean, there's plankton in the ocean, and the plankton is fed on by, the phytoplankton is fed on by zooplankton, and it releases dimethyl sulfide. And that can congregate in places like where there are underwater features, and the birds can sense those odors. And we know from other studies that the genes that are associated with odor reception in many species of birds are still expressed, suggesting that many birds, not all, but many birds like turkey vultures, kiwis, and some others have a better sense of smell than we give them credit for. And again, this is Bill Keaton from Cornell University. Some of you who took biology in college may have used Bill Keaton's general biology textbook. They use infrasound. In the center of that circle over there, with all the dots around it, is a place called Jersey Hill. And so the Cornell loft is, if you follow the dotted line to the right. So Jersey Hill seems to be a place where there's an infrasound shadow. And infrasound is kind of the sound that the Earth makes when the plates are moving. And it sounds like, it looks like they're using infrasound to get from one place to another. It helps them. It's one of the cues that they use. Because if you release them by Jersey Hill, they don't get it back. They don't make it back to the loft, because that seems to be a shadow for the infrasound. So, like us, birds use multiple cues at different scales, just like we do. Use multiple cues. Use landmarks. Right? We use GPS in our car, right? Which uses satellite positions to get from one place to another. So you see on phase 1, right? You're heading up from Central America. You have a pretty big target. But as you get closer and closer, right? You start to use different cues. And then you can use landmarks here, like in Toronto. And then finally to your previous nesting. So birds like the birds I studied, tree swallows, overwintering in Florida, sometimes they come back right to the same nest box. So they're using a variety of cues to get in the area, and then different cues to get to the exact place where they're going, just like we do, right? So we can use a highway to get to the general area, then surface streets, and then you can use cues like I make a right at the McDonald's to get to my brother's house, and then you can find it, right? But like I said before, if those cues are obscured or no longer there, like the McDonald's is not there anymore, where do I turn, right? So I can rely on some other cues. So how do birds get there and back again? They use multiple cues, right? They use multiple cues to do that. So, before any questions, there's, I always pitch allaboutbirds.org, because it's an excellent source of information about birds, and it's free, and it's easy to use. And again, please join us next month to hear about the birds of paradise of New Guinea. So I'd be happy to answer any, try to answer any questions. Yeah.
Have the strong northerly winds been a problem for, got it the wrong way around. So the birds are migrating south. Have the strong southerly winds been a problem for them?
Yeah, it makes them more expensive, right? Because they're flying against the wind, right? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, it makes it more expensive, right? More expensive to fly.
So
And you can get blown off course.
are the numbers still low for the season? Are they waiting and counting spots?
The birds will wait at stopover locations for better or ideal conditions to fly, changes in air pressure and wind direction and speed, to reduce their costs of migration. So sometimes we see up here, there are some records for Michigan of magnificent frigate birds, right up by Ludington and other places. They probably get swept up by those like hurricane-like winds that rip them up all the way up from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up here. So they just carry up on those winds. Yeah.
So, I think you said, and sorry if I get any of the details wrong here, but did you say that the like magnetic sensors in the eye are always in the right eye and sometimes in both?
Yeah, the bird that's been studied most closely is the willow warbler, garden warbler, and it's in the right eye. But in other birds, it's in both
The
eyes.
library will be closing in 15
But it's hard to do those kinds of, it's expensive to do those kind of studies, so not a lot of birds have been done.
Is it ever only in the left eye?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh.
Not that I'm aware of. Well, is there any, yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that birds, they just go back and forth, but is there, from an evolutionary standpoint, how do they impact the environments that they go to and from? Because it's usually some interaction or more of an interaction situation with an ecosystem.
Right. What we're finding is that we're seeing as I said before, we're seeing declines in North American birds by 30%, and part of it's loss of habitat here, but a lot of it's loss of habitat in Central and South America. So they get down to places that are historical and traditional overwintering sites, and the habitat has been turned over to farming, for example, or in places in Central America turned over to by narco groups growing coca and so on, marijuana. Yeah. So they're changing the forest to plant monocultures, which is usually bad for birds, not good for birds.
So are they like a food source? Like, well, speaking of bees and they pollinate, right? So how do birds, are they a food source for some?
No, they're definitely, when they get down to their overwintering grounds, they're a food source for predators, yeah. But there's usually, in the fall, when birds are migrating south, there's usually very large numbers because it's all those young of the year are moving south. So as I said before, like in Europe, literally billions of birds are flying through Spain and the Straits of Gibraltar across to Morocco and the rest of Africa, billions of birds. And so the Eleanor's falcon, as I said before, takes advantage of that because it breeds that. So they're food, but they're also, if they're feeding on fruits, they're seed dispersers in those areas, right? And if they're nectivores, right, they're distributing pollen. So they're important parts of the ecosystem, both here and on their non-breeding grounds. But they're losing habitat both here and on their non-breeding grounds, on their wintering grounds. Yeah.
Michael, do you know if raptors are also reticent to cross over large bodies of water?
Yes, they don't like to do it.
Really?
Yeah. They do, but they don't like to do it because there's no place to, and you get blown off course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so birds really try to avoid as much as possible flying. Some of them do fly over large expanses, but most of them try to avoid as much as possible. That's why you see them on the East Coast and instead of following the ocean coast, they follow the continuing ridge of the Appalachian Mountains south in eastern Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
And plus they have they get favorable winds coming off, updrafts coming off the mountains.
If they get eaten, if a bird with a transmitter gets eaten, will it signal or will that transmitter emit? How strong is that signal for them?
I think if it gets eaten if the signal's lost, or sometimes you can recover radio tags, but geolocators, you have to get them back by catching the bird again. But sometimes you can find the radio tags, because you use your antenna to find where the radio tag is. And people who use radio tags to follow birds, sometimes they find their subjects have been eaten by a predator, and they just find the tag on the ground. Well, if there are any other questions, thank you very much. And please,